This is an unusual programme, and for me, unique. Instead of being neutral, the dispassionate voice of the BBC, I've been invited to take you on a journey of my own. It's an excursion from innocence to war through my teens and early 20s, when I moved from London to go to university in Belfast. The Troubles in Northern Ireland didn't start as many people think. Unionists liked to portray themselves as victims of the violence, but it was loyalists that planted the first bombs and killed the first policeman. Republicans liked to portray the British as colonial oppressors, but the army marched into the cheers of the nationalist communities and saved them from attack. The British liked to think of themselves as honourable peacemakers, but they were ignorant and stupid and sometimes brutal too. The people in the South pretend they've played an honourable role. In fact, they've often been duplicitous and contemptuous of their neighbours and fellow countrymen.
I see nothing unreasonable in seeking equality of treatment for all citizens in any society.
No, I don't believe there was unfairness. What I do believe was that people couldn't see that it was fair.
The authorities reacted to us as if we had been IRA men. The RUC beat people into the nationalist camp. The RUC beat people into the Republican camp at that time.
In 1966, I arrived here at Queen's University in Belfast, just as I might have gone to Manchester, Edinburgh or Cardiff. For no particularly good reason, I found myself elected to represent the halls of residence here at the Student Union. And this now rather grubby-looking building, then brand new, was about to become the cockpit of political dissension. This parochial eating and meeting place was soon to find itself at the heart of events that would reverberate around the world. They were amazing times throughout the globe. The established order was under siege from the young. In France, Danny the Red was leading student protests that very nearly overthrew the French government. Further east in Czechoslovakia, with students in the vanguard, the Prague Spring almost brought down communism. To the west in America, black protest with Martin Luther King was at its height. Again, students played a powerful role in street protests and demonstrations. London was thronged by demonstrators against the Vietnam War. For the first time, youth really was emancipated. We were the post-Second World War baby boom generation. We had television, we had rock and roll, we had a certain amount of disposable income, we had free education, and we had a growing, if at times misplaced, belief that we knew better than our elders. Perhaps sometimes we really did. I mean, the Vietnam War was iniquitous. Racism was, and still is, odious. And Northern Ireland was stuck in a social and political time warp. Politics was measured by religion, not by left and right, so Protestants of all classes stuck together to exclude Catholics from power. The result was that Northern Ireland had one-party rule for almost as long as the Soviet Union. And as with any one-party state, opposition was seen as subversive. Student politics was a faint echo of the divisions outside, but the more I learned about Northern Ireland, the more, as an Englishman, I was astonished. Out in the real world, there were symbols of a siege mentality that was simply foreign to anything I understood as British. Just listen to this. Now, this is Stalinism, supposedly emergency legislation, in fact, sanctions held by Northern Ireland rulers to be used whenever they saw fit. This is the Special Powers Act. And the idea was basically to get people into prison here without going through all that bothersome procedure of putting them through the courts like that. Under the Special Powers Act, the authorities were empowered to imprison without charge or trial, in other words, intern people, arrest not just suspects, but witnesses too, and forcibly detain them and require them to answer questions, even if the answers would incriminate them. They could prevent the access of relatives or legal advisors, prohibit the holding of an inquest after a person's death, in other words, literally cover up a murder. They could ban newspapers, prohibit the circulation of any film or gramophone record, and just in case that lot hadn't got you banged up to rights, they could arrest any person who does anything calculated to be prejudicial to the peace or maintenance of order, which is not specifically provided for. To enforce all this, Northern Ireland had the RUC, a largely Protestant police, though nothing like as one-sided as many nationalists make out. On the other hand, the reservists, the B Specials, were an entirely Protestant force, armed and maintained by the state. And Protestants ran not just the police, but the judiciary, in fact top positions almost everywhere.
This ostentatious mansion was the seat of maladministration, Stormont. There's a popular myth that Prime Minister here, Lord Craigavon, once called this a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people, and that's often how it felt. But in fact, he was merely echoing a piece of unbridled racism from the south. It was the Irish President De Valera who'd called the Republic a Catholic country for a Catholic people. The south has always been quick to criticize the north, but tribalism was enshrined in the Constitution down there. Here, it was merely custom and practice. But wow, it was custom, and it was very widely practiced. One party, the Unionists, ruled here, and ruled absolutely. In half a tumultuous century, the only opposition bill that ever made it onto the statute book here was an amendment to the Wild Birds Act. Of course, Northern Ireland was democratic. It's just that, well, until the year I got here, 1966, conveniently, all 12 of Ulster's MPs at Westminster were Unionists. For local elections, there was what was known as gerrymander. In other words, people fiddled the electoral boundaries, usually to the advantage of the Unionist Party. And there was something known as ratepayer franchise. Put bluntly, if you didn't own your home, you didn't have a vote. And when I rented a student flat here in Magdala Street, just round the corner from Queen's University, I didn't have a vote. But if you owned property, specifically business, you could have several votes. In one celebrated case, one man had 34 votes. Now, this just wasn't politically unfair, because along with control of councils came control of who allocated council homes.
Housing was often bad for Protestants as well as Catholics. If any single issue lit the fuse, it was unfair allocation by local authorities.
And no example was more glaring than here in this little development of houses in the picturesque village of Caledon. One person here lit the fuse. Not a young firebrand, as you might imagine, but someone known as Nana.
Well, there was my husband and I and 6 sons, and then our daughter and her husband and 2 children, and she was expecting. She was pregnant and expecting another child.
And how big was your house?
It was 2 rooms downstairs and an attic upstairs that we had converted into extra room. That was the whole thing we had for 14 of us. So these houses were built in Caledon anyway. And instead of being allocated 7-6, they were allocated 13-1 to Protestants. So naturally we flew off the handle. I mean, we couldn't take that lying down. We had taken so much over all the years, but we had to stop somewhere. So we decided to squat in the houses that we should have got.
Nana's family was eventually evicted in favour of a young Protestant woman, but they refused to give up. They enlisted the help of a Catholic lawyer, Austin Curry.
Well, I had been an MP at Stormont for 4 years at that stage. I had been involved in a number of housing protests. Here was a situation where a house was allocated to a 19-year-old single girl in circumstances where there were 269 other people on the waiting list. I decided that this was a case of injustice that as a public representative I had to challenge.
A unionist, John Taylor, rejected these claims of discrimination, provoking a row that had Austin Curry ejected from Stormont.
Looking back on it, that whilst I say there wasn't discrimination, I think it was important that people could see that there wasn't discrimination, and the mechanisms were not there. It was all right for me to say Catholics are getting a fair share of their houses, but there was no means to show that this was true.
John, I can understand that looking back 30 years ago from the perspective you had then. But now, are you really saying, with the benefit of 30 years hindsight, you still don't believe there was unfairness?
No, I don't believe there was unfairness. What I do believe was that people couldn't see that it was fair. Now they can see it. The point system makes it clear that houses are allocated fairly in Northern Ireland.
Getting nowhere constitutionally, Austin Curry joined Nana's family and squatted in the house himself.
The fact that I was an MP meant that it was guaranteed publicity. And of course, that was what the Unionists were concerned about. And so that night, after I was evicted from the House, to turn on the 9 o'clock news from London and to see that I was interviewed on the news, and that for the first time what was happening in relation to injustice in Northern Ireland was being exposed, that made the Unionists very angry indeed.
Austin Currie teamed up with a small pressure group, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, known as the CRA or NICRA. And on August the 24th, 1968, Northern Ireland saw its first ever March for Civil Rights. This was a new sort of politics. A Republican tried to make a speech, but he was heckled down. His IRA was out of place here, in any case no bigger in the 1960s than the animal rights terrorists in England today. Its only achievement was in feeding unionist paranoia.
Deceived! The CRA is a Republican front organization, and the real enemy of every Ulster Protestant is the system of the papacy.
The CRA was just the IRA twisted round. The civil rights movement was a smokescreen. And behind that smokescreen rallied the whole agitation that has come out of it, the IRA. And I still say that I was right.
I certainly saw that the official IRA were involved in the civil rights movement.
Did you see the civil rights movement as a front for the official IRA?
Yes, I did, yeah.
Here at Queen's University, the tensions in Northern Ireland were played out in microcosm. One student, Ian Brick, came to epitomise the struggle. Now a successful businessman in America, then a unionist, a Protestant, president of the Students' Union. A decent and open-minded man, but he came to represent reaction against political reform.
We had to have that removed. Oh my goodness, the chair is still here. My gosh, what a very interesting office. The view hasn't changed.
The view hasn't changed. The chair used to be over there.
Chair used to be, that's exactly right. May I sit down in the chair and try it again? First time in 30 years? Yeah. I think I feel less important than I did then.
Feels like home, though.
I was I think a product of Northern Ireland at the time. First generation education, proud to be at university, parents really proud to be at university, with a lot of other people who felt the same. Catholic and Protestant mixing together. None of us had any worries or problems except to get our degree, and we did it in a structured way. And we ran the Students' Union, you're right, in a structured way. We didn't feel we had to go out and save the world. We were just trying to save our little patch and make things good for Northern Ireland.
In May 1968, at a big national students' meeting in England, one of your executive members, Sean McPhillamy, tried to raise some of the political issues going on here in Northern Ireland, specifically the Special Powers Act, with the then leader of the opposition, Edward Heath, and you stopped him. Mm-hmm. That created the most almighty row, eventually leading to a motion for your dismissal as president.
Sean had some great friends at the time. There was a guy called Nick Ross, I remember, was on that side of the equation.
Bricky was deposed. It was dramatic. Frankly, the issues were pretty trivial, but for some, there was a vivid implication. A Protestant leader could be kicked out by largely Catholic insubordinates. Ian Brick, quite rightly, fought back, and his supporters drew the obvious, if wrong, conclusions that he'd been overturned by Republican sympathisers. And that unleashed a fury that shocked and overswept each side. Here in the university, just as in the outside world, you could almost touch and feel the growing sectarianism. I recall addressing a mass student meeting that resulted. 2,000 people packed in here to the university's Whitler Hall. They turned out to restore the natural order. And it was a meeting that uncannily foreshadowed what would happen in the real world when massed loyalists would rise to reassert traditional Protestant authority against the Sunningdale Agreement and the power-sharing executive. But for me, here, whatever the arguments against Bricky had been, they seemed trivial in this explosive atmosphere. Perhaps we were all statesmen, perhaps cowards. At any rate, opposition to Bricky melted away. But then nothing was worth provoking ancient bigotries and bringing violence onto the campus.
When I came over here, very quickly, my sympathies were allied to the nationalist population. It seemed that they were discriminated against. They were second-class citizens. Was I wrong?
No, there was discrimination, and there was a very definite need for change. But it had to be at a pace that was acceptable. For example, I met my first Catholic friends in this very university, in these very rooms. Catholics sat together with Protestants on the executive, of which you were part. We knew there had to be change, but it was the pace of that change that was very important.
In fact, the Unionist leader, Captain Terence O'Neill, realised the pace of change must quicken. In the 1960s, of the Beatles and space travel, the ancient divisions in Ireland seemed absurd. In this age of the common market, he even, shock upon shock, shook hands with the Prime Minister from the Republic.
Captain O'Neill recently said that the south of Ireland was a very beautiful young lady and that he was very glad to talk to her over the hedge. Of course, Captain O'Neill's a married man and he shouldn't be talking over the hedge to any young ladies.
O'Neill has been vilified as a weak man, stiff, remote, aloof from many of his colleagues and out of touch with ordinary people. And at the time, I subscribed to that view myself, but I think I was wrong. He was certainly a distant man with no feeling for his grassroots supporters, but he was perceptive enough to see that reform had to happen. He was courageous enough to fight for it. And his biggest weakness was inside his own government, people at his back, people like John Taylor.
O'Neill was a poor leader as far as we were concerned for the parliamentary party. He came over as an Englishman to the ordinary man on the street, which meant he didn't appeal to them, in other words. He didn't have the charisma that you would need in a situation in politics. And then, thirdly, of course, he was talking about changes, reforms, and meeting the mass. But here was a government down south which even refused to recognise the existence of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. And this caused resentment here. So he was doing things which upset Unionists.
From this point, there are two antagonistic views of history. One has it that Republicans saw a chink in the armour of what had been implacable Unionism, and Terence O'Neill opened up the floodgates to nationalism, treason and violence. The other is that Unionist right-wingers sabotaged reforms, exposing Northern Ireland to civil unrest, to international ridicule. Well, I prefer the second view. As an Englishman abroad, because that's how it seemed given the tribal antagonisms here, it looked plain as daylight that reforms would have to come, and that by trying to stonewall them, right-wingers like Bill Craig and Ian Paisley were aligning themselves with prejudice and malice. Another march was organised for October here in Londonderry. And if any single day or any single event can said to be the start of the Troubles, well, this for me was it. Saturday, October the 5th, 1968. But once again, history defies popular mythology, because if there was any single leading figure on that precipitous day, it wasn't a man for whom civil rights was his great crusade, and it certainly wasn't a Republican. It was a real-life revolutionary socialist.
Well, the idea for the October 5th March came originally from myself and Eamon Malach, who was a friend of mine in Derry at the time, and we had been involved with a number of other people in agitation on the allocation of houses and against the unfair voting system and so forth. And we phoned the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association in Belfast after the Coal-Line and Dungannon march and suggested to them that they might run a similar march in Derry. They agreed. That's how it happened.
You chose a contentious route, though. You must have known it would cause trouble.
Well, when the delegation from Nickrach came down to Derry, it quickly became apparent to us that they didn't know very much about Derry, and they didn't understand the little sensitive nuances of various things in Derry. We outlined a route for the march to them, which we knew was going to be provocative, because we were going to march within the city walls in Derry, And there had been a long tradition that this unsullied patch of Protestant territory inside the walls of Derry had never been sort of stained by an anti-unionist march, and we were proposing to do precisely that. I think the leaders of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association had no idea of the significance of that, and they simply said, OK, let's. It sounded like a reasonable route to them.
Any person who wishes to parade or hold a meeting is quite at liberty to do so, provided he holds it other than in an area specified in the order made by the minister.
We are the people of Derry and we intend marching in our city.
You went out on this march knowing that there was going to be a confrontation. You deliberately provoked them.
No, we didn't deliberately provoke them, because our argument was and would remain that to march through the centre of this city against the unionist rule of this city could not reasonably be regarded as provocative, not by a reasonable person. The fact that it was regarded as provocative by the RUC and the authorities simply illustrated to us what an undemocratic lot we were dealing with. I certainly knew immediately after the October 5th march and the police attack on the march that something huge was happening. And indeed, on the day after, on the 6th of October 1968, a Sunday, I remember walking down Rossville Street, and people were saying in so many words, things will never be the same again. Over and over again, people used the exact words, things will never be the same again.
On the Tuesday after that bloodshed in Londonderry, Queen's University began its new academic term. Students assembled and we were in turmoil. There was a great and seething meeting, full of passion. People were outraged at the police brutality over the weekend. We felt we had to show that civil rights was not about republicanism, and that if we marched, Protestants, Catholics, students from Ulster, from Great Britain, and from all around the world, we could make a stand against sectarianism, as well as support the struggle for what seemed simple and pretty straightforward human rights. The university is just up there, but this is Belfast Shaftesbury Square, and we were told that several hundred Paisleyites were waiting to ambush us here. I proposed we take a diversion, but I lost the vote, and so we headed off. In the event, we got as far as here. This is Linen Hall Street, where the Paisleyites had moved ahead of us. And up there, just short of our destination, the police threw a cordon across the street. Unable to move forward, we, some 1,500, 2,000 students, simply sat down in the street. And we could hear Paisleyites around the corner shouting, "We shall never submit to the students' papist blackmail." Well, I was a student, but certainly no papist, and didn't regard myself as a blackmailer. What we were trying to achieve is what everybody now seems to have accepted as perfectly reasonable and proper in Northern Ireland. But things quite quickly looked as though they could go very, very sour indeed. Fire engines arrived. At one stage, the police drew batons at the front, and people at the back here, unable to see what was happening at the front, wanted to move forward. Eventually, after a long time, the student leader who'd organised the march, a Protestant as it happens, made a brilliant, calming speech, and we all eventually got up, singing "We Shall Overcome," but feeling rather we'd been overcome. We headed back to the university.
The whole civil rights movement was deeply coloured by republicanism. You, as a stranger to Northern Ireland, naturally might have joined in a students' march, but that was not the basic end of that. The basic end of that was an attack upon traditional unionism.
The union was in great excitement. There were mass meetings here in what in those days, in the 60s, was the great debating chamber, a sign of changing times and of changing student passions, that they've now turned it into a disco. But here in this hall, on that night, a group of students seized the moment. Basing themselves on the American civil rights movement, they decided to set up a civil rights organisation here in the university, one without any formal leadership. It became known as the People's Democracy, or plain PD.
Again, contrary to Ian Paisley's view, the prime movers weren't Republicans so much as socialists, like Michael Farrell.
I've been very influenced by the American Civil Rights Movement, by the anti-Vietnam War movement and by the Paris student uprising, and it was that sort of politics, mass politics on the streets, that we felt could change the world, and in particular in this case the American Civil Rights Movement was the parallel, that we felt we could achieve civil rights in Northern Ireland by the same sort of tactics.
This is BBC Northern Ireland. The Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, Captain the Right Honourable Terence O'Neill.
Ulster stands at the crossroads. I believe you know me well enough by now to appreciate that I am not a man given to extravagant language. But I must say to you this evening that our conduct over the coming days and weeks will decide our future.
Ulster didn't, at those crossroads, go the way he thought it ought to do.
Yeah.
You were one of those responsible for driving it in the other direction.
Yeah, we're very often told we're at the crossroads in Northern Ireland. That there must be a lot of crossroads in this province. I remember that speech. As I say, I disagreed with Terence O'Neill as a leader for the reasons I've already given you, and I just felt he was not the man to lead Northern Ireland at that difficult time.
I would go to meetings in Glengall Street and see this man trying to do his best to sort out Ulster. Ulster at the crossroads. What sort of a Ulster do you want? Absolutely right. And being given a terrible time, a very hard time, by the mandarins of the Unionist Party. And I wept for him sometimes. I really did.
This then was the crunch. The Times in London, echoing something I'd told my parents a month before, said Northern Ireland is on the brink of civil war. At this point, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association agreed to halt all the marches. But one person in particular either couldn't see the danger or didn't care. He vowed to keep the pressure on.
We felt that O'Neill's package was completely inadequate and that he could not deliver more himself within the Unionist Party. So we thought if there was a moratorium and it continued for some time, just nothing would happen. And that we'd caught the imagination in Britain and around the world with the October the 5th March and subsequent events, and that it was necessary to keep that momentum up, to keep Northern Ireland on the agenda, because we really believed that only when the British government intervened would there be any change.
Michael Farrell played his cards when I and most other students were away on our Christmas holidays. On the 1st of January 1969, he and 40 others set off on what they call the Long March from Belfast to Londonderry. Now, they knew that people like Paisley and Bunting would try to stop them. But it wasn't just the marchers who were heading for a trap. So were the Loyalists, a political trap that would ensnare them and their beloved province for 30 years.
The one march that I was very worried about was the march of students from Belfast to Derry, which was attacked at Burntollet and which led to widespread violence. I was very worried about that march, and I had asked that that march not take place because at the time the then Prime Minister, Terence O'Neill, had indicated that he was going to introduce reforms.
To be honest, Michael, I honestly felt betrayed over that Christmas holiday when I learned that the march was going ahead, after I thought we decided it wasn't going ahead.
Well, the vote not to go ahead had reversed a previous vote to go ahead, and that's just the way the organisation worked at the time. I mean, my view then was, and it was the culture of the time, that people took on protests, entered on protests, if they wanted to. Well, we left Claudy, which is a couple of miles up the road here, that morning, and about 200 yards up the road from this spot, we were stopped by the police, and the senior officer called me over and said, there may be a bit of trouble up ahead. They detained us there for about half an hour, and we had a meeting, and I put it to the marchers, and the way I put it was that there might be
a good possibility of some stones being thrown. Some people may be hurt somewhat. However, police have said they are quite prepared to get us through this obstacle.
We came down the hill, we came to this point, there was a high hedge, and so we couldn't see this lane. at this stage. When we got to the junction of the lane, suddenly a crowd of people burst out of there armed with sticks and stones and iron bars and attacked the march.
Were people badly hurt?
Some people were quite badly hurt and taken to hospital, yes.
Well, I'm so tired of crying, but I'm out on the road again. I'm on the road again. Well, I'm so tired of crying, but I'm out on the road again.
The Burntollet ambush turned the whole mood to violence. When the demonstrators got to Londonderry, just as John Hume had feared, the march descended into full-scale riots.
You know, the first time I traveled out in the rain and snow, in the rain and snow. You know, the first time
There is no doubt in anyone's mind, after the events of the last 4 days, that law and order in this part of the world has broken down and that it is very one-sided.
In early 1969, the People's Democracy decided to put up candidates for election to Parliament, not with any real hope of winning, but to qualify for free postage and free publicity. Bernadette Devlin, fresh and wonderfully articulate, shone out. In April 1969, aged 21, standing for civil rights in a by-election, she became Britain's youngest MP and made headlines around the world.
I think these people voted civil rights because they wanted change. Our manifesto was, as it were, a list of preconditions necessary for democracy to be born in Northern Ireland.
As I remember from the first meetings that we had, where you came to prominence, you really were non-political. You were apolitical. You didn't have a strong political view of any sort.
No, nor was I involved in the politics of the Students' Union. And I came here essentially to get a first-class honours degree in psychology.
You would be ahead of me in psychology. I was so intensely frustrated I could have shouted at times when I was a student here in the early 60s that Westminster refused to get involved. Now, when you went to Westminster, you found this writ large. Was it that Westminster was, to its roots, unionist, or was it just ignorant and frightened of getting involved?
They were ignorant in the sense of not being informed and not being in possession even of any basic knowledge of the social, political forces that were at play.
But you wanted to get them involved, didn't you?
Well, they had a responsibility.
With Whitehall refusing to intervene, the one-party state began to unravel. The reformist Terence O'Neill resigned, but Protestant right-wingers were not appeased. Loyalists planted bombs that damaged electricity installations. Catholic homes were attacked and burned, and in riots by Protestants, the first police officer was killed. In August 1969, Catholic tensions exploded. Catholic youths threw stones at a loyalist march in Londonderry, and it quickly turned into full-scale confrontation.
The time for hesitation's through. There's no time to wallow in the mire. Darling, we could only lose, and our love become a funeral pyre. Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire.
That night, in the Battle of the Bogside, part of Derry lay under siege. The violence quickly spread to Belfast, where, in a conspicuous piece of heroism, the RUC defended Catholic homes against a murderous Protestant mob. But law and order was gone. At 5 p.m. on Thursday, the 14th of August, 1969, 300 men of the Prince of Wales' own regiment marched out of barracks and onto the streets of Derry.
So when word came, it spread in an instant around the area, sort of that there were British soldiers marching across the bridge. The initial feeling sort of was one of enormous relief, but enormous relief because a new element had entered, and as if sort of the real bosses in London had sent, you know, the guys in to take control of the situation. It was also interpreted, of course, and accurately, that this was a defeat for the RUC.
But the military involvement was ill-prepared, and in a fatal decision, it was limited to Derry. Ironically, the first soldier to die in the Troubles was killed while off-duty in Belfast before the army proper got there. B Specials and a Protestant mob had gone on the rampage, and among Catholics killed was Trooper Hugh McCabe, hit by a bullet fired by police into his home. When terrified Catholics had called on the IRA for help, the IRA as a fighting machine simply didn't exist. Graffiti went up, IRA equals I ran away. So when eventually the troops marched into Belfast, they were met with the same rejoicing by Catholics as in Londonderry.
I'm very pleased that they are here, because if they hadn't been here, I wouldn't have been here. It was a terrible time we had those 2 nights. Terrible.
And you feel safer now?
Certainly, I do feel quite happy about it. Quite happy about it. I was up with the soldiers the first one Sunday morning. They were here at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Well, you went to see them?
I went up and gave them their tea, their breakfast.
Thank you.
That's for after your lunch or after your dinner.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
I was thrilled when the troops came in, and I thought, now at long last, Downing Street must get properly politically engaged and sort things out. And so too, in a prescient warning, did the army commander.
The honeymoon period cannot, I do not think, continue forever, obviously. But unless there is a solution or some hope for the future, and this is where the politicians have got to come in, the soldiers are not going to be welcomed on the streets for forever and ever.
If only the politicians had acted as swiftly and decisively as the army commanders warned they should. In 1969, right-wing Unionists were in no position to resist wholesale reforms that would have brought Northern Ireland into line with England, Scotland and Wales. The civil rights campaigners would have had no further cause. Above all, the IRA would have found no purchase. How much did Whitehall understand? How much did Whitehall know about Northern Ireland prior to the trouble starting?
I would think very little. After all, the whole essence of the partition of Ireland was on the part of Great Britain to make the problem go away. And they thought that they could wash their hands of the problem, they'd solved it. But of course they hadn't. And so Northern Ireland was part of the Home Office remit, but there was only one chap in an attic in the Home Office who kept a benevolent eye on what was happening in Northern Ireland.
If you didn't understand much, why not listen to your military commander? I mean, giving Stormont control of the British Army was exactly what he warned against. It made a neutral force become an instrument of the Unionists. I know it wasn't your decision, but wasn't it a mistake?
Probably, yes, with the benefit of hindsight. But one didn't, at the time, have the benefit of hindsight.
I have decided to exercise, where necessary, the powers of detention and internment vested in me as Minister of Home Affairs.
At this point in the story, there's one thing that, being English, I feel particularly ashamed of, which fed support for terrorism and which outside working-class areas of Northern Ireland has never been understood. The routinely oppressive behaviour of some regiments of British troops.
Let me give you a small example. It's one of hundreds I heard of when I was working as a radio reporter. But this is the first case of army brutality that ever got on the air, and not without arguments with the army and with the BBC. I'd interviewed a housewife who had saved a soldier's life. She dragged the wounded man into her flat and protected him until help arrived, which was a pretty courageous thing to do. A few months later, she sent me a Christmas card. But now her attitude had changed. A friend of hers had been beaten by the army. I went to meet him, and here are some of my notes. He was a respectable young man who'd been lifted by the army for interrogation. At first, he says he was treated well, but then some squaddies started into him. The hospital doctor confirmed to me that the man's injuries were consistent with his story, and the army themselves confirmed that he had been with them at the time. But guess what their excuse was? The colonel told me,
truth being stranger than fiction, he was hit by one of the doors, and he was knocked down
I must say, very hard on the floor, and was picked up by one of my corporals and dusted off.
There were thousands of similar allegations.
From this point on, the story of the Troubles is well rehearsed and pretty depressing. Parliament remained ignorant and uninterested. General Freeland turned out to be right. Reggie Maudling and then other politicians failed to act decisively enough. And as piecemeal reform followed piecemeal reform, there was meat enough to feed resentment on both sides of the sectarian divide. Nature abhors a political vacuum, and the IRA and the Protestant paramilitaries swelled to fill the void.
As a result of developments like the false curfew, and particularly after internment in August 1971, when there was when people in areas like the Bogside were just raging mad at what was being done to the community, the civil rights militants and left-wingers generally really had no sort of prepared channels to try to direct that anger into, and no structure of organisation to try to recruit people into, and no commonly accepted and clear set of political ideas that we were trying to impose upon the situation. And the one group, and the one group which emerged from that situation and which had absolutely clear ideas, had a clear explanation of what was happening. This was Britain oppressing Ireland, and that it was therefore necessary to have an organisation which was going to fight back against Britain. The one group that came out with that analysis and with the organisation to give expression to that analysis was, of course, the Republican movement.
The IRA made a comeback. They'd had a conference just outside Dublin in February 1970. They'd split into the officials and the provisionals. The provisionals decided to carry on the armed struggle, and they were starting to make a comeback at that time. So they subsumed the civil rights movement. It ceased to be a civil rights movement. It became an armed struggle.
The Unionists made it true, as the Unionists have always made it true, by ensuring that there is no peaceful mechanism for the progress of either social, political, economic equality of nationalists or Catholics.
The Unionist populations, if they had dealt generously, more generously, with the legitimate grievances of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, I wouldn't be the only one who would say this. I think a lot of unionists would agree, my generation certainly, and certainly the younger generation, if they had dealt more generously at a time when they had power to be generous about it, things would have taken a different course. I'm quite satisfied. After all the key demands of the civil rights movement have been met long, long ago. And Northern Ireland now is a much fairer and more juster place, but only because of being under the spotlight of international and national opinion.
Oh, pass. Oh, pass me not,
How did the civil rights story end? How did it grind into the sand?
Well, you can date the end of the civil rights era, so to speak, at any number of points. I mean, some people would say that when the first baton fell on the first head in Duke Street on October the 5th, 1968, really, the civil rights option of peaceful advance towards democracy was gone.
I want you to hear just listen.
And of course, the last major appearance of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association itself on the streets was the 30th of January 1972 in the city, Bloody Sunday, and I think the civil rights movement was on its last legs even then, maybe, but certainly it was shot to death by the Parachute Regiment in Derry on Bloody Sunday.
I 'Cause 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 I you. in the harm to call my name, Jesus. It's not in the harm to call my name.
In 1972, I left Belfast after 6 or 7 turbulent years. By now, small-minded politicians had created a terrible stability. Everybody had their second best option. Unionists had staved off any progress towards a united Ireland. The Nationalists, the Catholics no longer had an unbridled Protestant hegemony at Stormont. The Brits had managed to contain the violence. Certainly the Provisional IRA had achieved absolutely nothing of any political importance, and still haven't after 30 years. I'd learned that the nicer people are, the harder they fall out. I'd come to sympathise with loyalist resentments, but I was still so frustrated at that unionist inability to look forward rather than backwards. I was despairing of the Catholic tendency to lapse into a romanticised nationalism that causes people to get killed. But my greatest contempt was for my fellow Brits, for that misplaced sense of superiority, that when it came to the crunch we'd behaved as badly as anybody else, that misplaced sense that we'd been neutral when we weren't, or that we'd been honourable, which we hadn't been. And I suppose I was annoyed that I and people like me, who had no tribal commitment to one side or the other, that we'd allowed the militants to get the upper hand.
It's not in the heart.